And it was a 5-4 decision by the Supreme Court to let the sentencing proceed. So we should talk about that as well. Peter Baker, jump in here. This is the first time we've had a president-elect and a former president who has been convicted of a felony and will serve in office with that hanging over his head. First of all, the historical perspective of that and what it appears, how that appears to the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think it's worth not forgetting just how extraordinary this is, right? Among all the talk about the legal options here and the arguments in court there and what this appeals could stand on and so forth, we are about to see something we've never seen in just 10 days, a convicted felon as president of the United States. And what it tells us is that the bar has changed, right? The bar has moved. The public knew this. The voting public knew about this conviction. They knew about the evidence. They made a judgment on how important they thought it was or wasn't. And more of them decided it wasn't disqualifying than those who thought it might have been, obviously, given the results. And I think that's a remarkable moment and a shift in our political culture. He has moved the bar not just for himself. He's trying to move it now for other offices as well. Think about some of the people he has put forward for high office in the cabinet to run the FBI, the Defense Department, and so forth. People who have been accused of remarkable things that would never been allowed in a cabinet officer before. And he's basically daring the Senate to stop these nominees as well. And so he has redefined what it means to be a high official in our government. And there's going to be, precedent now going forward, not just in a legal sense, but in a political sense going forward for generations to come.
And Chuck Rosenberg, talk about the Supreme Court on a number of levels, because the court allowed the sentencing to take place. They now could be asked, we'll bring this up in a moment, to take a look at the 11th Circuit decision, which is allowing Jack Smith's report to be released imminently, potentially. But the Supreme Court breakdown was 5-4 in the other direction. And it was not just Amy Coney Barrett, but it was Chief Justice John Roberts agreeing with the three liberals, so-called liberals on the court. What do you make of all that?
That's right. And I think Joyce Vance articulated it well. It was a 5-4 decision to allow the sentencing to take place today. The three so-called liberal justices were joined by Amy Coney Barrett and Chief Justice Roberts. And if you read their short, 1.5-page order, Andrea, as I'm sure you've done, you saw that two things were important to the Supreme Court, or at least to the 5 justices who thought the sentencing ought to go forward. One is that Mr. Trump, as an ordinary criminal defendant, can raise issues on appeal in the appellate courts of New York and perhaps the Supreme Court of the United States. But also, obviously important to those 5 justices was Justice Merchan's promise, essentially, that there would be an unconditional discharge, that there would be no other penalties that attend the conviction, that the sentencing would be final today, and there would be no encumbrance upon the office of the president. And that mattered. Now, this case, or something like it, may come back to the Supreme Court when Mr. Trump initiates an appeal of the underlying conviction. Does the majority hold? Does the immunity decision that we got from the Supreme Court last year now, does that have implications for whether or not the conviction will stand? These are open questions, but it was a very interesting alignment, I think, of the Supreme Court. And as Joyce pointed out, and I think she's absolutely right, it mattered, at least to Chief Justice Roberts and to Amy Coney Barrett, that Justice Merchan was going to sentence Mr. Trump today to no further encumbrance, that he would be granted an unconditional discharge, and there would be nothing hanging over the president or the office of the presidency when he assumes office in 10 days.
Joyce Vance, I want to ask you also, as a former prosecutor, what you think about Justice Alito talking to President-elect Trump on Tuesday about a job application from a former clerk to the new Trump administration, just hours before the Trump appeal for the sentencing was filed. There's been a lot of stir over this, about whether the call should have been made and whether it should have been taken by the justice. knowing full well this was the way the week would play out?
So I think the answer to whether the call should have taken place is unequivocally no. It was entirely inappropriate for Justice Alito to have this call with the president-elect, knowing that this case was headed towards the court. And what's particularly discouraging in this entire scenario is that Justice Alito, when called on it, his response was that he didn't realize that this was about to hit the court, which I think every other legal analyst and probably, people in the grocery store checkout line and your plumber and the people serving you dinner at the restaurant, everyone knew that this was going to land at the Supreme Court, that there might also be other matters, including the 11th Circuit matter. So that really struck in a very disingenuous light and underscores the reality that this is a Supreme Court that's unencumbered by any sort of enforceable ethical code where a president can have a conversation with a Supreme Court justice and they can say to the public, well, it was about something entirely different. In this case, Justice Alito was trying to get a job for one of his former law clerks in this White House. But that doesn't make it any less discouraging, any more of a strike against the ethical outlook of this Supreme Court.
Peter Baker, let's talk about that for just a moment, because the justice system, the jury system, was really at stake here with the sentencing, according to Judge Merchan, according to the prosecutor. That's why they wanted to proceed. What about the court's reputation? One of the arguments here was that Donald Trump has damaged the reputation of the judiciary, but the court system by talking about witch hunts so much. And what about the reputation of the Supreme Court as this continues?
Yeah, I think that's been one of the casualties of the last few years, is that rightly or wrongly, courts and judges, and even specifically the Supreme Court, look increasingly like just another political body. We talk about who appointed the judge, which president appointed the judge, as if that was a D or an R next to their name. That wasn't always the case. The Supreme Court, until not that long ago, had Republican appointed justices who were fairly liberal and Democratic appointed justices who were fairly conservative, or at least were iconoclastic about their views and weren't necessarily as predictable as today. So you have to wonder, and I don't want to put put the Chief Justice on the couch, but you have to wonder whether or not that was going through Chief Justice Roberts' head yesterday, along with Justice Amy Coney Barrett, about whether or not the perception that the court has been helpful to President Trump by, issuing its immunity decision, for instance, last year, whether he decided that this was one step too far, one red line that he wasn't going to cross, and demonstrate that the court remains an independent body, that in fact it will not simply take its orders or toe the line with the president. He said that in a message just a few weeks ago. He made very clear that in taking on the Trump camp view that some court decisions might not necessarily be abided by, he made the point that that's how the system works. You have to live with court decisions that you may not like, and if you don't do that, then the system is going away.